4 years into the war in Ukraine, something unexpected has happened. The collapse that many predicted never came. Russia did not break under pressure. Its economy did not implode the way analysts forecasted. And most importantly, Vladimir Putin is still firmly in control. At the start of the conflict, the dominant assumption across the United States and Europe was clear. Sanctions would isolate Russia. Financial systems would freeze. Internal unrest would grow. And eventually, the political structure at the top would begin to crack. It seemed like a familiar pattern, one seen in other heavily sanctioned states. But Russia did not follow that script. Instead, what emerged is a far more complex reality. A country under immense economic pressure, yet still functioning. A military facing resistance, yet still capable of sustaining operations. And a leadership model that appears not only stable, but deliberately designed for this kind of long-term confrontation.
To understand why this happened, you have to look beyond the battlefield. Because this war is not just about territory or military strength. It is about systems. It is about how power is built, maintained, and protected under pressure. And in that sense, Russia operates very differently from what many in the West are used to. In most Western democracies, power is distributed across multiple institutions. Governments rely on public approval, independent media, and competing political forces. This creates flexibility and openness, but it also introduces friction during crises. Decisions take time. Narratives compete. Public opinion shifts rapidly. Russia, on the other hand, has spent decades moving in the opposite direction. Power has been consolidated. Decision-making has been centralized. Key sectors, from energy to media to national security, are closely aligned with the state. This structure is not built for speed or transparency. It is built for control and endurance. And during a prolonged conflict, endurance matters more than anything else. One of the most critical elements in this system is narrative control. In any war, perception becomes just as important as reality. How people understand the conflict shapes how they respond to it. In Russia, the government has maintained a consistent message from the beginning. The war is not presented as an invasion, but as a defensive action against Western expansion. It is framed as a necessary step to protect national interests and security. This framing does more than just justify the war. It creates a psychological buffer against dissatisfaction. Economic hardships, rising costs, and international isolation are not seen as failures of policy. They are presented as sacrifices in a larger struggle. And when a population accepts that narrative, resistance becomes far less likely to organize at scale. This does not mean there is no opposition or frustration within Russia. There is. But the system is designed to manage it, limit it, and prevent it from turning into a unified movement. Information flows are controlled. Alternative narratives struggle to reach mass audiences. And without coordination, dissent rarely becomes a serious threat to centralized power. At the same time, the economic side of the equation tells another important story. Sanctions were supposed to be the decisive factor. Western governments imposed unprecedented restrictions targeting banks, exports, technology, and key industries. The expectation was that Russia's economy would rapidly contract under this pressure. Initially, there were clear signs of disruption. The currency weakened. Foreign companies exited the market. Trade routes were suddenly cut off. It looked like the beginning of a sharp decline. But then something shifted. Russia adapted. Energy exports were redirected toward new markets, particularly in Asia. Trade relationships were reconfigured. Domestic production increased in certain sectors. The system did not recover fully, but it stabilized. And in geopolitics, stability under pressure is often more important than growth. What this reveals is a critical misunderstanding that shaped early expectations. The goal of sanctions was to force a rapid collapse, but Russia was not structured for rapid collapse. It was structured to absorb shocks, redistribute pressure, and continue functioning even under strain. And that distinction changes everything, because as long as the system continues to operate, the leadership remains secure. There is no immediate trigger for internal breakdown, no single moment where everything suddenly unravels. Instead, the situation becomes a test of endurance, one that Russia appears prepared to sustain. Meanwhile, on the military front, the war itself has evolved into a slower, more grinding conflict. Quick victories are no longer the objective. Instead, the focus has shifted toward incremental gains, resource management, and long-term positioning. This kind of warfare does not produce dramatic headlines every day, but it does serve a strategic purpose. It buys time, time for the economy to adjust, time for political systems to stabilize, and time for international dynamics to shift, because global attention does not remain fixed forever. Over time, priorities change, new crises emerge, political leadership rotates. And in that environment, a prolonged conflict can begin to lose its urgency on the world stage, even if it continues on the ground. This is where Russia's approach becomes particularly strategic. It is not trying to win quickly, it is trying not to lose over time, and that is a very different objective. For Western audiences, this creates an uncomfortable reality. The assumption that pressure alone would force change is being challenged. The idea that economic isolation guarantees political instability is no longer holding up in the way many expected. Instead, what we are seeing is a model of power that is more resilient than anticipated. Not invincible, but resistant. Not thriving, but surviving. And in geopolitics, survival is often enough to maintain control. So the question is no longer whether Russia is under pressure. It clearly is. The real question is whether that pressure is translating into meaningful change at the top. And so far, the answer appears to be no, because the system was never designed to break easily. It was designed to last. As the war stretches deeper into its fourth year, the battlefield itself begins to tell a different story than the one many expected at the beginning. This is no longer a fast-moving conflict defined by dramatic breakthroughs. It has become something slower, more calculated, and far more difficult to resolve. For Western audiences, the early phase of the war created a clear emotional and strategic narrative. Ukraine was resisting, Russia was struggling, and with enough support, the balance could shift decisively. But over time, that clarity has faded. What replaced it is a prolonged stalemate, where progress is measured not in sweeping victories, but in small, incremental changes. And in this kind of environment, time becomes a strategic weapon. Russia's military approach has adjusted accordingly. Instead of relying on rapid advances, the focus has shifted toward attrition. This means exhausting the opponent over time, militarily, economically, and psychologically. It is not about speed, it is about sustainability. This strategy carries significant costs. Casualties accumulate, equipment is lost, resources are continuously consumed. But it also creates pressure on the other side. Because sustaining a prolonged war requires constant support, constant funding, and constant political will. And that is where the equation begins to extend beyond the battlefield. In the United States and across Europe, support for Ukraine remains strong at the institutional level. Governments continue to provide military aid, financial assistance, and diplomatic backing. But public opinion is more complex. Over time, prolonged conflicts tend to lose urgency. Voters begin to ask questions. Priorities shift toward domestic issues. Economic concerns take center stage. This does not mean support disappears, but it does mean it becomes less predictable. And unpredictability is something Russia can work with. Because if there is one consistent pattern in long-term geopolitical conflicts, it is that unity is hardest to maintain over time. Alliances require alignment not just in strategy, but in political timing, economic capacity, and public sentiment. And the longer a conflict continues, the more difficult that alignment becomes. This is particularly relevant when looking at NATO. The alliance remains one of the most powerful military structures in the world. Its combined resources, technology, and strategic reach far exceed those of any single country. But NATO is also a coalition of independent nations, each with its own internal pressures. Energy policy, defense spending, economic stability, these are not abstract concepts. They directly affect voters. And when voters feel the impact, political leaders must respond. Russia's strategy does not need to break NATO. It only needs to test its cohesion. Even small fractures, differences in policy, delays in aid, disagreements over priorities, can create opportunities. Because in a prolonged conflict, consistency matters more than intensity. A steady, unified approach is far more difficult to maintain than a strong but short-term response. At the same time, the global landscape is shifting in ways that complicate the situation further. Countries outside the Western alliance are not all aligning in the same direction. Some maintain neutral positions, others deepen economic ties with Russia, trade routes evolve, financial systems adapt. This does not eliminate the impact of sanctions, but it does dilute their effectiveness over time. And that brings us back to a key point. This war is not isolated. It is part of a broader global realignment. Power is no longer concentrated in a single axis. It is distributed across multiple regions, each with its own interests and priorities. In that environment, pressure becomes harder to concentrate. For Russia, this creates space to operate, not without challenges, but with enough flexibility to avoid total isolation. Energy exports continue, even if at adjusted levels. Trade partnerships shift rather than disappear. And as long as these channels remain open, the system retains its ability to function. Meanwhile, inside Russia, the political structure continues to prioritize stability above all else. Leadership messaging remains consistent. Institutional control remains intact, and despite external pressure, there is no visible fragmentation at the top level. This is a critical factor that often gets overlooked. Because in many historical conflicts, it is not external pressure alone that leads to change. It is the combination of external pressure and internal division. When leadership begins to fracture, when elites lose confidence, when competing power centers emerge, that is when systems become vulnerable. So far, that pattern has not clearly appeared in Russia. That does not mean it cannot happen, but it does mean that predicting it based solely on external pressure is unreliable. And this is where the Western understanding of the situation faces its biggest challenge. The expectation of rapid change has been replaced by a reality of gradual adaptation. The idea of decisive turning points has given way to a slow, uncertain trajectory. For audiences in the United States and Europe, this creates a difficult question. What does success actually look like in a conflict like this? Is it territorial gains? Is it economic pressure? Is it political change inside Russia? Or is it simply preventing escalation and maintaining stability over time? These are not easy questions to answer, and they become even more complex as the war continues, because every additional month changes the context. Resources shift, political cycles evolve, public attention moves, and with each passing phase, the original assumptions are tested against reality. For Russia, the objective remains relatively clear: maintain control, sustain operations, avoid decisive defeat, and wait. Wait for pressure to redistribute. Wait for alliances to adjust. Wait for global priorities to evolve. It is not a strategy built on immediate victory. It is a strategy built on persistence. And persistence in geopolitics can be a powerful advantage, especially when your system is designed for it. As the war moves forward, the question is no longer just about control. It becomes a question of trajectory. Is this a system that is simply surviving under pressure, or is it slowly reshaping the balance of power in its favor? Because there is a difference. Survival is defensive. It is about holding the line, absorbing impact, and preventing collapse. But reshaping the balance of power is something else entirely. It is about turning pressure into leverage, time into advantage, and uncertainty into strategic opportunity. Right now, Russia exists somewhere between those two states. It is not winning in the traditional sense. There has been no decisive breakthrough that ends the conflict or secures a clear strategic victory, but it is also not losing in the way many predicted. The system remains intact, the leadership remains stable, and the war continues on terms that Russia appears prepared to sustain. For Western audiences, this creates a critical moment of reassessment, because the assumptions that shaped the early response are no longer enough to explain the present. The expectation of rapid collapse has been replaced by a reality of prolonged resistance, and in that reality, the metrics of success become harder to define. At the same time, the cost of continuation continues to rise for all sides involved. Ukraine faces ongoing pressure on the battlefield, requiring constant support to maintain its position. The United States and European countries must balance external commitments with internal political and economic priorities. And Russia continues to operate under sanctions, resource constraints, and long-term structural challenges. No side is untouched by the weight of this conflict. But the key difference lies in how each system processes that pressure. Western democracies operate on cycles: elections, policy shifts, public opinion. All of these factors influence decision-making. This creates adaptability, but it also introduces variability. Long-term consistency can be difficult to maintain when political landscapes change. Russia operates with a different model. Decision-making is concentrated. Political timelines are less influenced by public cycles, and strategic direction can remain consistent over longer periods. This does not make one system inherently stronger than the other, but it does create different strengths and weaknesses in a prolonged conflict. And in a war defined by time, those differences become more visible. Another factor shaping the future is the broader global environment. The world is not static. Power dynamics are shifting. Economic networks are evolving. And new geopolitical priorities are emerging across multiple regions. In this context, the Russia-Ukraine war is not just a regional conflict. It is part of a larger transformation in how global power is distributed. The dominance of a single, unified global order is being tested. Alternative partnerships are forming. Regional powers are asserting greater independence, and international alignment is becoming more fluid. For Russia, this creates both challenges and opportunities. On one hand, it faces continued pressure from Western alliances. On the other, it benefits from a world that is no longer fully aligned against it. This reduces the effectiveness of isolation and allows for strategic flexibility. And flexibility, once again, supports endurance. But endurance is not without limits. Over time, the accumulation of pressure matters. Economic constraints can compound. Military strain can build. Technological gaps can widen. Even the most resilient systems face long-term challenges that cannot be ignored. So the real question moving forward is not whether Russia can endure in the short term. It is whether it can sustain that endurance over the long term without significant internal change. And that is where uncertainty returns. Because while the system has proven more resilient than expected, resilience is not the same as permanence. Conditions evolve, pressures shift, and outcomes remain open. For viewers in the United States and Europe, this uncertainty is the most important takeaway. The war is not approaching a simple or immediate conclusion. There is no clear endpoint visible from the current trajectory. Instead, what lies ahead is a continuation of complexity, a prolonged phase where outcomes are shaped gradually, not suddenly. And in that environment, perception becomes critical. How the conflict is understood will influence how it is approached. Overconfidence can lead to miscalculations. Underestimation can lead to strategic gaps. And assumptions based on early expectations can fail to account for changing realities. That is why understanding the structure behind the conflict matters just as much as tracking the events within it. Because what we are witnessing is not just a war between two countries. It is a test of systems, a test of how different models of power respond under sustained pressure, a test of how alliances hold together over time, and a test of how global dynamics evolve in a rapidly changing world. And within that test, one thing has become clear. Vladimir Putin remains in control not because the pressure is weak, but because the system around him is built to absorb it. It is structured to centralize authority, to manage information, to adapt economically, and to endure politically. That does not guarantee long-term success, but it does explain short-term stability. And in geopolitics, stability, especially under pressure, is often the foundation from which future outcomes are shaped. So as the war continues, the focus shifts, not just on what is happening on the ground, but on what is holding everything together behind the scenes, because that is where the real story is unfolding. And that is the part most people didn't expect.